Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski. Glad to be with you. A little different today for this episode. Rather than bring on a guest, I'm actually going to share with you a presentation that I had developed for the Art of Command Conference in Middleburg, Virginia in the fall of 2023. The focus of the conference was the Overland campaign and the start of the Overland campaign. And they asked me to talk a little bit about Robert E. Lee's command structure. And I thought that would be a fantastic opportunity to talk about the B team that Lee has with him as he's going into what becomes the most consequential campaign of the entire war. I'm going to start by actually getting into the campaign a little bit to the 24th of May, 1864, and Lee has set the perfect trap along the North Anna River, and Ulysses S. Grant stumbles into it. A portion of Grant's army actually here on the eastern front moves forward and comes across this eastern leg of what is known as the inverted V of Lee's position. Another portion of Lee's army comes here to the western leg, and so that separation of Grant's position means that his two wings of the army are separated by 6 miles, 2 river crossings, and as each wing advances, it gets farther and farther away, giving Lee the opportunity to either snap this part of the V shut like a trap and crush part of Grant's army there, or crush part of the army here against the river. And Lee says, we must strike them a blow. We must strike them a blow. But Lee is racked by dysentery, confined to his tent, unable to take the field and unable to strike that blow himself. Who does he have to strike that blow for him? Well, his second in command, Richard Ewell, who's down in charge over here. By this point, Lee has begun to lose confidence. Not just begun, he has well lost confidence in Richard Ewell. Ewell, of course, is sick with dysentery himself at this point, but he's had a few bad days at Spotsylvania Courthouse. He's not necessarily been a strong performer in the previous fall campaign, and so Lee does not have a lot of confidence in Ewell. Is it Richard Anderson, who is new to command? He's only been in charge of the First Corps for a couple weeks, filling in for the wounded James Longstreet. You can also see that he's anchoring the full line here, so he himself can't really move and swing that jaw shut. So, Anderson's not the guy. What about A.P. Hill, commander of the Third Corps over here on Lee's left? Well, just the night before, Hill had done poorly at the Battle of Jericho Mills, a little further off to the northeast, the latest in a string of disappointing performances. And so, Lee doesn't have a lot of confidence in his Third Corps commander. That poor performance at Jericho Mills on the 23rd was so bad, in fact, that Lee scolds Hill and says, why did you not do as Jackson would have done and thrown your whole force against them and driven them into the river? And that had to sting, because of course A.P. Hill and Stonewall Jackson didn't get along at all. And Hill is one of Jackson's successors. To have Jackson's legacy thrown in his face like that, ouch, ouch, ouch. And so the fact that Lee is calling back to one of his most trusted subordinates, and why couldn't you have done that? It's one of the only times we have on record that Lee actually conjures the spirit of Jackson up. And so Lee really feels here on the banks of the North Anna River as though he doesn't have his A-team. Okay, he's working with men he can't really trust to strike that blow. And he himself is really the indispensable man of the Confederacy at that point. And this is only the third week of May, 1864, with a lot of campaign left to go. So as Lee thinks about his A-team, he thinks about those glory days of James Longstreet over here, his hard hitter. That's why I have him there as B.A. Barabbas. I pity the fool that messed with old Pete. And then we've got Stonewall Jackson here in place of Murdoch, because of course Jackson is the crazy one, also the one willing to sort of pull out these amazing feats. The handsome debonair face, Dirk Benedict, well, of course, that's Jeb Stuart, the great cavalier who's flashy and fantastic and still dependable and provides great service to our fantastic Robert E. Lee here, who is the George Peppard of the A-team. Let's break that down a little bit. First, we've got the First Corps commander, James Longstreet, Lee's old war horse. He's also called Old Pete, as we know. And Lee gets to know Longstreet's work, particularly during the Peninsula Campaign, which he sort of watches from afar, and during the 7 Days Campaign, where Lee works with Longstreet pretty directly. Now, Longstreet is not one of those guys you'd have ever pegged as being a rock star once upon a time. He graduates second to the bottom of his class at West Point, but he does great service in the pre-war army, where of course he knows Ulysses S. Grant. He serves in Grant's wedding party when Grant gets married, because they're stationed together out in St. Louis. He goes off and serves well and with distinction in the Mexican War, as so many of his classmates did. And then throughout the Civil War, he earns a well-deserved reputation on the battlefield for being a heavy hitter, starting right with that first major conflict at First Manassas, where he's at Blackburn's Ford, involved in some heavy fighting around there. Jubal Early will come and help him out and kind of swing the tide of battle in that area. Through the 7 days, he continues to be a guy that Lee can call on to hit and hit and hit. At Second Manassas, of course, we see him really kind of roll up the Federal flank there and drive John Pope from the field. In fact, I would argue that, we tend to think of James Longstreet as this defensive-minded commander, but I think his best days in the war are when he is hitting, because he hits hard. Second Manassas definitely demonstrates that, but we could see that again at Chickamauga, for instance, where he rolls into an empty space in the Union line that's there by a freak accident. He makes the absolute most of that assault and completely throws the Federal position into complete disarray because he hits so hard. We could look at the Wilderness, where he shows up at just the moment of crisis at just the right time, smashing into a Federal assault with a counter assault of his own that throws the Federals back. So when Longstreet hits, he hits hard. And that's why Lee's going to come to depend on him pretty quickly. In the wake of the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, Lee is going to officially reorganize his army, and he is going to promote James Longstreet to lieutenant general and make Longstreet his second in command. He actually dates Longstreet's commission 1 day earlier than Stonewall Jackson, who will be in charge of the Second Corps. We'll talk about Stony J in just a few minutes. As folks know, I'm a big Stonewall Jackson fanboy, but there's a reason that Lee depends on Longstreet as his second in command. He's level-headed, he's dependable, he's a hard hitter, and I do think that sort of defensive-mindedness, that caution that he has, is an important counter-check to Lee, who is aggressive, audacious, and realizes that he needs that little bit of check to kind of just be a sounding board to keep him honest. And I think Lee really values that with Longstreet. I think he also enjoys Longstreet's company. When they're on the campaign, Lee tends to hang out with Longstreet. Now, a lot of Longstreet critics will say, oh, well, that's because Lee didn't trust Longstreet, so he's got to keep a sharp eye on him. I think that is balderdash. I think they enjoyed each other's company. Longstreet was probably a lot more fun to hang out with Stonewall Jackson than Stonewall Jackson was. And again, I'm saying that as a Jackson fanboy. Jackson really was not known for having a lot of festivities and good time and good humor around his camp. So no wonder Lee wanted to hang out with Longstreet. And so I think that that's a really important command dynamic that gets set up. And Longstreet will end up getting the short end of that stick in the long run, because of course, after the war, because of his close association with Lee, he's willing to criticize some of Lee's decisions, because he was in on the discussions and he was behind the scene and he was playing devil's advocate. And by voicing support for Confederacy's Marble Man, he'll get written out of a lot of Confederate history. It's important for us to situate him in his place, in his time, as Lee's second in command and as someone that Lee strongly depended on. That is not to sell short Stonewall Jackson, the man that I just think is fantastic on the field, because he's able to pull out these brilliant maneuvers out of nowhere, seemingly with very little to work with. Of course, he's best known for his work in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1862, where he marches up and down and up the Shenandoah Valley, covering vast distances over short periods of time, earning his men the nickname Jackson's Foot Cavalry. He beats 3 armies that outnumber him more than 3-1. And he's doing this all on the sort of broad suggestions of Robert E. Lee, who at the time is in Richmond serving as the military advisor to Jefferson Davis. Jackson's looking for some sort of official sanction for what he's doing. So he's in communication with Lee. He's sort of like, well, if you think about maybe doing this, and that's all Jackson needs. And boy, he takes that and runs with it. And Lee really appreciates that independent mindedness, that aggressiveness, that willing to take chances, that willing to be audacious, the discipline required to drive those troops to achieve amazing things at a time when the Confederacy is really seeing loss after loss after loss across the rest of the board. Jackson is that shining point in the spring of 1862. And that builds a huge bridge of trust between Jackson and Longstreet, even though they're working one in Richmond and one in the Shenandoah Valley. So when Lee eventually assumes command of what becomes the Army of Northern Virginia right before the 7 Days Campaign, and he brings Jackson to join him up. Jackson, of course, does not perform well during the 7 Days Campaign, but Lee has great faith in him because he knows what he's been able to accomplish. He understands that Jackson is exhausted and gives him a little bit of a free pass that Jackson himself probably would not have given a subordinate in those conditions. And Lee does shuffle people out of that army who don't perform well in the 7 days. But he really, Jackson has earned a cachet with Lee that lets him survive that poor performance and then thrive in those months afterward. Jackson, again, not necessarily an outstanding student when he was at West Point. No one you would necessarily peg for success, except that he started near the bottom of his class in the first year and worked his way slowly, doggedly upward. His classmates thought really highly of his work ethic, thought that if they'd had a fifth year, he would have been near the top of his class because he worked so hard to get where he was at. And of course, that grit and determination serve him well on the battlefield, starting at First Manassas, where he earns his nickname Stonewall Jackson. Again, I think it's balderdash. People who think that that's a criticism. If there's Jackson. He's not moving. He's standing like a stone wall. If that was the intent, his men would not have adopted that as their nickname. They were proud of the fact that they stood there like a stone wall. And I think Lee recognized that, as he's sort of assessing Jackson's capabilities as well. I'll just point out the quote here. I don't always like to read all the bullet points on my slides, but you may be whatever you resolve to be. That sense of resolve, that was Jackson's guiding principle, and that drive, that resolve, that's something that Lee really values highly. And so when Lee reorganizes the army after Antietam, he only feels that he needs these two corps commanders to be in charge of his infantry. But he does need some cavalry support. Major Jeb Stuart will get the call there. The young dashing cavalier, does really well during frontier duty. Lee knows Stuart really well. They have the chance to work with each other. When John Brown takes over the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Lee goes out to oversee that situation. He takes Stuart with him, and Stuart's kind of the man who executes the orders on the ground. He'll be in charge of the 1st Virginia Cavalry. He'll again do good service in Manassas, the peninsula, where he rides around McClellan, makes himself one of the most famous Confederates in the world by this flashy, daring maneuver. That's going to put him on the radar screen of a lot of people, including Robert E. Lee. He'll serve well during the Second Manassas Campaign, providing excellent intelligence for all of the moving parts of Lee's army, which is probably his most intricate campaign because of all the different ways that his different infantry corps are moving and the way the divisions within the corps are moving. And Stuart is keeping everyone well informed with what's going on through that whole thing. And then, of course, at South Mountain and Antietam, he also is serving providing good service for Lee, good intelligence about the movement of the Union Army, which is coming after Lee pretty quickly at that point. Lee really values Stuart, but he knows that Stuart also does need to be kept on a leash. Stuart loves those headlines. He loves that flashiness. He's going to ride around McClellan again around Chambersburg in the fall of 62 after the Antietam campaign. And it's going to be another one of those rides around the army that's going to get him separated from the army during the Gettysburg campaign. And Lee always knows exactly what to say to Stuart to properly admonish him and encourage Stuart to do better. And to Stuart's credit, he always seems to respond to those sorts of criticisms really well, because he always does do better after those sorts of criticisms. So that's the A team. And they have glory days all through 62 and into 63. But of course, the band will break up. Who is the Yoko Ono that breaks up the band? It's going to be James Lane and his North Carolinian Brigade. But just like Yoko Ono didn't really break up the Beatles, James Lane really didn't break up Robert E. Lee's A-Team. Stonewall Jackson is out on a reconnaissance on the evening of May 2nd, 1863, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, putting himself between his main line and his picket line, trying to figure out what to do next. It's a job you send a lieutenant to do. It's not a job that you, as a lieutenant general, do. So I point this out because really Jackson's the one who puts himself in harm's way. And that's going to be an instinct that we'll see out of Lee, we'll see out of Longstreet, leading from the front. It's one of the things that make them effective commanders. But really, with the fog of war hanging over Chancellorsville, dark night, thick woods, weird shadows from the full moon, it's a risk Jackson really didn't need to take at the end of the day. So he'll get himself accidentally shot by his own men. And a few days later, he will end up dying on the 10th of May, 1863, from complications, not just from the wound, but because he's sick. He's got pneumonia. That pneumonia will accelerate, hidden by the fact that he's wounded. He's lost a lot of blood, and that trauma hides the fact that he's sick. And so Jackson will end up dying. So I think that overshadows what I think is a more important factor at Chancellorsville as we talk about this leadership aspect. Okay, we've got a huge percentage of Lee's army that ends up as casualties. 22% of Lee's army becomes casualties, including, and this is important, 5 brigade commanders and 3 division commanders. So as we're looking at leadership opportunities and, who do we promote upwards, we're seeing a huge drain on the talent pool that Lee has to work on. So Lee realizes that Jackson's wounding does present him an opportunity. He's got to fill that position. But as he writes to Jefferson Davis, the 2-corps system has proven to be just a little too big, a little too unwieldy. And so he wants to use this as an opportunity to reorganize the army a little bit more extensively. I have for the past year felt the core of this army were too large for one commander. Nothing prevented my proposing to you to reduce their size, but my inability to recommend commanders. So already this notion of who should step up. No one is a Longstreet. No one is a Jackson. No one is a Stuart. And Lee has recognized that. Now his hand is forced by this vacancy. And so he says that, the loss of Jackson from half the command seems to me a good opportunity to remedy this evil. He calls it an evil. That's how problematic he has seen this. That's a strong word to use. And so he really feels compelled at this point to do something. So the first person he's going to tap is Richard Ewell, Old Baldy. He's been Stonewall Jackson's right-hand man up to this point in the war, the most dependable, hard-fighting division commander that Jackson has. He's earned himself a great reputation. He's 46, which is, for the time, relatively old. But if we think about it, and I think that Old Baldy gets a bum rap here, because there's Old Pete, who's also the old war horse, and we've got Old Blue Light Stonewall Jackson, whose eyes were so blue that they shone in the ferocity of battle. You can see even in this black and white picture, his eyes are so blue they show up as blue, which is pretty incredible. We've got Old Jube, Lee's bad old man. So let's put him up here as an old man, so he really kind of fits that mold. The man so profane that he's supposedly the only one willing to swear in front of Robert E. Lee. That's why he's a bad old man. We've even got Old Allegheny, Edward Johnson, who had served under Jackson, who'll be coming back to the army in a little while after he recovers from his foot wound. So we've got a lot of oldness here. I don't know that Old Baldy necessarily deserves that sort of moniker. We even have A.P. Hill, whom Gouverneur K. Warren calls your old boyfriend when he writes to his wife and talks about how he beats Hill at Bristow Station and later again at Jericho Mills. So, a lot of oldness in this army. But Richard Ewell is someone who is dependable. He has served well with distinction in the Mexican War. He just has an excellent field service. He's going to be the first field grade officer to be wounded during the Civil War at Fairfax Station in 1861. Following the Battle of First Manassas, he will actually suggest to Jefferson Davis that he's willing to lead freed enslaved men into battle and have their service exchange for their freedom. And Davis lets that idea drop. Ewell never broaches that subject again, but it's worth noting it doesn't kill Ewell's career the way it will later kill Patrick Cleburne's career for suggesting the very same sort of thing. Ewell is one of the great eccentrics of the war. We'll talk about that just a little bit. But he complains early on, even in his pre-war army days, of suffering from vertigo, nausea, attacks of the ague, which is a great word that we can to haul out here today to talk about Ewell. He's going to have service during Jackson in the 62 Valley Campaign. He thinks Jackson is nuts because Jackson doesn't tell him anything. Just be here at a certain time, certain place, be ready to go when I tell you to. And Ewell's like, what the heck? And then Jackson starts winning. And then Ewell's like, oh, maybe this guy knows what he's doing after all. He's got a little bit of genius to him. And Ewell, supposedly a pretty profane man, sees Jackson as a very pious man. It's like, if these sorts of victories are part of what religion will do for you, I want me some of that. And you will actually begin this reformation of his character, inspired by Jackson in many ways, as a combat leader, as a religious man. And that will play out, particularly after Ewell loses his leg at Bronner Farm in August of 62 during the Battle of Second Manassas. He'll go back to Richmond to recuperate, where he will meet up with his cousin Lysinka, whom he'd had a deep affection for. She ended up getting married because he was off in the army, and so he at that point had swore he was going to be a lifelong bachelor. The girl of his dreams was gone. Can't have her. He's going to be married to the army for the rest of his career. Her husband ends up dying, and so she's a widow. So when they meet again in Richmond during his convalescence, they get married. And he will continue to introduce her as my wife, Mrs. Brown. But they will have a great successful marriage. She's actually one of the wealthiest women in all of Tennessee because of her first marriage. So Ewell marries into that fantastic situation. Everybody knows he's not money grubbing because the two had a relationship, romantic relationship previously. And I will say, for everything that's about to happen to Richard Ewell in our story today, he will get his happy ending. He's going to live out his days in Spring Hill, Tennessee. He's going to have a plantation out in Mississippi that he himself is going to try to manage for parts of the year. He's going to turn out fat and happy, and I think he deserves that ending. One of Stonewall Jackson's former staff members, talks about Ewell being one of these great eccentrics. Richard Taylor, who had served under Jackson, describes Ewell as a compound of anomalies, the oddest, most eccentric genius in the Confederate Army. That's saying something for a guy who had served under Stonewall Jackson, who was an odd, eccentric genius in the Confederate Army. No man had a better heart nor a worse manner of showing it. He was in truth as tender and sympathetic as a woman, but even under the slight provocation, he became externally as rough as a polar bear. And the needles with which he prickled sensibilities were more numerous and keener than porcupine quills. His written orders were full, accurate, and lucid. That's going to be really kind of important later on when we talk about his command style. But his verbal orders or directions, especially when under intense excitement, no man could comprehend. That also is going to be important for us in a few minutes. At such times, his eyes would flash with a peculiar brilliancy, and his brain far outran his tongue. I know that feeling. He's just a great, colorful character who earns a well-earned reputation on the battlefield for being a hard fighter. Also, to replace Jackson as Lee restructures this army is going to be Lieutenant General A.P. Hill, or he'll become Lieutenant General. Little Powell, he's not old, except as old boyfriend here. Um, Again, like so many of these guys, Mexican War experience. He's going to be serving out in the Seminole Wars, or down in the Seminole Wars. He's going to lose girlfriends to George McClellan and Gouverneur K. Warren. He's unlucky in love, so unlucky in love that he will end up with some sort of social disease that he catches during West Point. It's going to set him back a year in his year of graduation, and that social disease will plague him throughout the rest of his life, including during his upcoming campaigns here in 1864. Starts out as the colonel of the 13th Virginia. He's the brigade commander by Williamsburg. He then becomes commander of the Light Division, which is supposed to be a flexible, fast-moving, fast-maneuvering, sort of a light brigade. Even though it's the largest division in the Army, it's still supposed to be a flash strike force. And he will have conflicts with James Longstreet during the 7 Days campaign. So Lee will solve that problem by assigning him to serve under Stonewall Jackson, beginning with the Cedar Mountain campaign, where on day one, Hill and Jackson get off on the wrong foot, and that will plague their relationship. So Hill can't seem to get along with anybody. Now, without an immediate superior, he perhaps will thrive just a little bit better. That conflict with Jackson is something that festers and festers and festers. Eventually, by the time Jackson is mortally wounded at Chancellorsville, A.P. Hill is up on court-martial charges. And all through the winter of 63, early 63, Lee's been trying to get Jackson to just drop the charges, let it go, and Jackson won't. And so, this has been coming to a head for a while. And if Jackson isn't wounded, that will eventually, burst out into something and become a huge command problem for Lee. So in some ways, Jackson's wounding is going to alleviate that and allow Lee to move up into that position. And Hill, he thought Jackson was a crazy old Presbyterian fool, and nobody ever blamed Stonewall Jackson for anything. So if something goes wrong, I'm going to get the blame for it. Probably one reason why Hill wasn't eager to take over after Jackson's wounding during the Chancellorsville campaign. He gets wounded in the legs. He's like, "Oh wait, I can't take command. Somebody else better take over this debacle," which Jeb Stuart will do, connecting with Lee, winning the battle, and then Hill comes back. Oh, how convenient. So with this new command structure, Lee moves north in June, and the Gettysburg campaign happens. And I've got William Morgan Sheppard here as Isaac Trimble, one of my favorite movie scenes where Trimble just eviscerates Ewell's performance. But Ewell starts out the Gettysburg campaign really well with a strong victory at Second Winchester. People think those predictions, the new Stonewall Jackson, are actually coming true. And he lives up to that. But then he gets to Gettysburg and has some problems, in part because A.P. Hill, when he gets to Gettysburg, also has some problems. Now, think about what happens on that first day. A.P. Hill, his column is leading the way into Pennsylvania. Lee has given everybody orders not to bring on a general engagement. Suddenly, there's the sound of artillery up front, gunfire. Lee rides up the hill and says, "What's going on up there?" And Hill's like, "I don't know." Really poor start to the campaign, and things for Hill don't get any better. His corps is going to take some brutal fighting on that first day of the battle, so much so that when Ewell shows up in the battlefield and drives the Federals off the field, and then has the opportunity to continue driving, taking Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, Hill himself, A.P. Hill, got Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, A.P. Hill. Hill says, "Oh no, my guys are too beaten up. I can't support you." So then Ewell's put in the uncomfortable position. Should he attack with no support on his right? And I think that that's one of those really important things that gets overlooked because, Stonewall Jackson, people love to put him there. He would have attacked. Jackson was well aware of how vulnerable flanks could be. What was he doing at Chancellorsville, after all? So do you think Jackson would have attacked with a potentially vulnerable right flank and a word that there's a potential Yankee force on his left flank? Not at all. So I think Ewell performs in much the same way Jackson would have done based on Jackson's own record. But, Nobody writes a novel where Ewell gets to tell his side of the story. Nobody makes a movie with a fantastic scene with an actor who just chews the wallpaper all the way through. Oh my gosh, it's such a great scene. And so Ewell ends up getting vilified essentially for not being Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg. He doesn't perform well because he's not able to take Culp's Hill. And so, he's assessed poorly. AP Hill on the second day of July will also perform poorly as James Longstreet comes in and hits hard as he's wont to do. Hill is supposed to pick up that attack, and he doesn't. He doesn't go onto the field to supervise, and so the attack will peter out instead of carrying forward, which then would have swept over to Hill's front, and everything, as Lee had envisioned, would have kind of come to a big crescendo. Doesn't happen. And of course, Longstreet himself is not without controversy at Gettysburg either. Longstreet and Lee don't see particularly eye to eye about how to carry out this attack, what they should be doing. After the war, Longstreet says, oh, well, we had talked about swinging around and drawing the Federals out. Lee's never able to tell his side of that story. And because Longstreet's kind of grumpy and petulant, Lee is going to basically override him. Well, he means the commander, so there's no overriding him. But instead of having Longstreet execute orders, he'll turn to Lafayette McLaws and say, well, can you carry out these orders? And McLaws is like, yes, sir. He's in that weird spot between Longstreet and Lee. What are you going to do? That particular moment in the morning of July 2nd is a result of the fact that Longstreet, during the Chancellorsville campaign, had been down in Suffolk, Virginia, in the southeast corner of the state on a foraging mission. And so two of his divisions stayed with Lee in Fredericksburg and were involved in the Chancellorsville campaign, Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson. Lee has the chance to work directly with both of them, serving not only as Army commander in Chancellorsville, but as a corps commander, commanding that half of Longstreet's corps. So he develops a relationship with Lafayette McLaws that he pulls back out during the Gettysburg campaign. So Lee is trying to readapt to this new command structure overall. His old war horse has had a taste of independent command and is sort of feeling his oats. And then Hill and Ewell just underperform. Now, it is worth noting that Hill and Ewell were trained under a particular command style. Who was their previous commander? Stonewall Jackson. What was his command style? Do what I say, when I say it, exactly as I tell you to, or you'll be under arrest. You don't need to know commander's intent, just obey. And, that does give Jackson some pretty good success, even if it's puzzling to his subordinates. But Jackson gave very explicit orders that he expected to be carried out in explicit ways. And if you didn't, you ended up in the hoosecow. So when Ewell and Hill are elevated to that same level of command, and Lee has a very different command style, who's sort of like, I'd kind of like this to happen. Lee's like a mafia boss in that regard. Like, here's kind of what I want to have happen. But he doesn't give specific orders. He doesn't say, you do this. And so Hill and Ewell don't know how to operate in that kind of context because their previous commander was extremely explicit and did not rely on them to use their discretion as much as Lee really relies on his subordinates to use discretion. So with all of these different command dynamics, we can rate Gettysburg as an oops. So now Lee leaves Pennsylvania, realizing that he has to command in a different way. He's got to mentor these two new corps commanders. He's got to reevaluate his relationship with Longstreet, except Longstreet then is going to go west. He's going to be called to help reinforce things out around Chattanooga. And of course, if we think the command structure in the East has been problematic, look where Longstreet gets to land, right in the middle of one big happy family of warm, fuzzy generals who all get along really well. Braxton Bragg, one of those men we love to hate, hated deeply by Leonidas Polk, who we also love to hate. We've got William Hardee, who's just got a huge ego on him. John Breckinridge, former vice president, also big ego on him. D.H. Hill, a man so cantankerous that Lee shifted him out of the army. only to then serve as an ongoing thorn in Lee's side, because when Lee needs reinforcements around the Chancellorsville campaign and in the wake of it, he has to ask D.H. Hill for reinforcements out of North Carolina, and Hill's like, I'm not giving you any Hill. So this is the dysfunctional command structure that James Longstreet's going to find himself smack dab in the middle of it. And in all of the worst ways of a middle school girl, Longstreet is going to just get right in with the whole, and I say that as the father of a girl who'd once been in middle school, so I'm not stereotyping, I'm talking out of experience. And it was just a toxic environment that brings out the worst in Longstreet. Longstreet will then have command problems of his own that are going to date back to the wounding of John Bell Hood at the Battle of Gettysburg early in the attack on July 2nd. If I ended up like John Bell Hood, I would look like a sad puppy dog too. I always kind of feel bad about his hound dog eyes there. He'll be grievously wounded then at Chickamauga after just coming back. I mean, like, Longstreet's army's loading onto the train going to get it to Georgia, and Hood's like, I feel well enough to go, and he goes and then gets wounded again, 3 inches below his hip. It's considered almost a near certain fatal wound. 10% survival rate, and he survives. He defies the odds, but it's going to be a while before he comes back. And so as a result, he's going to eventually be replaced by Micah Jenkins, although Evander Law also has a claim to commanding Hood's division. And so this command structure is really going to fester and fester and fester. And you would just think that, some guy's going to get promoted. That's going to be that. Law deserved that promotion. Longstreet really kind of has a thing for Micah Jenkins as one of his protege. He gives him that command, so there's going to be a lot of stress between these two. Law will then really kind of have some problems at Watachi in October, which then kind of casts him in an even worse light and just draws out this controversy, causing lots of strain in the relationship with Longstreet, and this will just fester and fester and fester. Law's situation in particular is going to continue to fester all the way till Longstreet comes back in the spring. He'll eventually be wounded at Cold Harbor and then ask for a transfer to the cavalry, which Lee will grant to him because of this ongoing controversy that's going to get the War Department involved and court martials and complaints. So Longstreet's going to have these problems here with some of his subordinates. He's also going to have problems with arguably his hardest fighting subordinate, Lafayette McLaws, who, when Longstreet invests Knoxville in November, that siege is not going to go well. Longstreet's men will be repulsed, and Longstreet will look for a scapegoat, and that'll fall on McLaws. And so McLaws will end up getting brought up on court-martial charges. That will get long and messy. He'll be removed from command. That's something I think that dates back to that grievance that comes up at Gettysburg when Lee turns to McLaws and says, will you carry out my orders that Longstreet seems to be giving me grief about? And he said it in just that very same cheesy Confederate accent. And McLaws like, oh, yeah, sure. And so that's going to be problematic for Longstreet too. There's also going to be difficulty with Jerome Robinson, who's heading Hood's brigade, serving under Jenkins. It's going to be so bad that Robinson will only accept written orders because he thinks the whole thing is a boondoggle. And so Longstreet will remove him from command. He'll replace him with John Gregg, who has done excellent work out in Mississippi for the Confederates during the Vicksburg campaign. Gregg will lead Hood's brigade coming into the Wilderness campaign, and he'll eventually get wounded in the Overland, or killed in the Overland campaign. Robertson's men petition to have him come back. Law's men his officers petition to go out to Georgia and Alabama on recruiting duty and protests against violence. So it's just like, just a big mess below Longstreet, even as all this command problems above Longstreet are also going to be difficult. So again, this is all going to feed into where things are going with 64. Meanwhile, back east during the Forgotten Fall, during the Bristow Station campaign, A.P. Hill is going to find himself being aggressive the way Lee wants him to be, but he's going to be a little over aggressive. He's not going to have good intelligence from Jeb Stuart, who sort of gets distracted and pulled away. So Hill will initiate a battle without really knowing what he's getting himself into. He'll get his nose bloodied by Gouverneur K. Warren at Bristow Station. By the time Ewell gets on the scene to help relieve Hill and follow up the attack, it's too dark for Ewell to launch an attack. It's worth noting that Lee is traveling with Ewell. Lee's the one who's sort of overseeing Ewell's deployment and telling him where to go. So when the attack launches the following morning, Warren has already escaped into the defenses of Centerville. And so Lee is super frustrated because there was an isolated portion of the Union Army that Lee could have attacked and destroyed, and the opportunity evaporates. He's so disgusted that he just lays into Hill, and Hill just sort of shrinks in his shadows. And again, Lee realizes, I need this man. I need him to perform. I've got to prop him back up. And he says, why don't you bury these poor men and let's talk no more of it. And I think Lee takes out some of his frustration there on Ewell, even though Lee was with Ewell and directing him on where to go. Lee can't be at blame here. So, it's going to be a confidence blow for both of his subordinates as a result of this. And then Ewell actually has been having problems with his amputated leg. He's going to take some time off after this to let the leg recover. Jubal Early is going to take his place in command of the Second Corps temporarily. And this is going to start getting Lee thinking, maybe I've got an opportunity here to give Early more responsibility if I can just find a way to really kind of keep Ewell back in Richmond, but he can't really resolve that yet. So going into the fall campaigns or the spring campaign season, Longstreet's going to come back and join up with Lee, and this is going to be the A team heading into 1864. We still have Longstreet. We've got our B.A. Barabbas. I pity the fool. We still have our handsome debonair Dirk Benedict, played by Jeb Stuart, and we've got Stonewall and Jackson over here, split into two. Nobody's doing especially well. Now, I should also point out that as Lee's getting ready for this, the condition of the army is not especially strong. He's going to get his numbers back up to about 66,000 men. Grant's going to come east. Lee's not sure what to do, doesn't know exactly what to make of Grant. And then Grant's going to start moving at the beginning of May. And we're going to see how the B team or the A team, A.1 team does here. And doesn't do very well because calamity strikes almost immediately. On the second day of the Battle of the Wilderness, May 6th, James Longstreet leading a powerful counterattack that drives the Federals back into their trenches, showing up on the battlefield at just the right moment, at just the right place. The crisis is, on the edge of destroying Robert E. Lee's army. Longstreet comes to the rescue and gets shot by his own men, leading a flank attack through the wilderness just a few miles, and 1 year and 4 days after the same thing happened to Stonewall Jackson. And so this is catastrophic for Lee. And I would say at this moment in the war, Longstreet's loss is worse than Stonewall Jackson's was at that moment. Because, as we know now in hindsight, this is going to turn into a very defensive-minded campaign for Lee as he digs in. And who is his defensive-minded general? James Longstreet. So we're getting into some of the very kind of warfare that Longstreet really does well at. But also, there's nobody in Lee's army that knows anything about Ulysses S. Grant, except for James Longstreet. The two had served together in St. Louis, remember? Longstreet had been part of Grant's wedding party. When Grant was named lieutenant general and put in command of all Union armies, Longstreet says, that man will fight us every single day until the end of the war, drive us back into the river. And so the one guy who can give Lee some insight into Grant, taken off the board right at the beginning of the campaign. Also killed during this action is Longstreet's protege, Micah Jenkins. So in all of that controversy with Evander Law, looks like Jenkins is going to be the winning horse, and the winning horse is knocked out. And in his place, we're going to have this leadership vacuum over Hood's old division. So who's going to take the place of Old Pete? The stalwart old warhorse that Lee has been depending on, that Lee leans on, that Lee cherishes. We're going to name Richard H. Anderson. Fighting Dick. Who's he? Well, that's because the senior most division commander in Longstreet's corps at that point is going to be Charles Field. Anybody heard of Charles Field? No? That's the point. So at first, Lee thinks, well, Jubal Early, he did a pretty good job filling in the fall. Here's a chance to have him take over permanent corps command. But Early's from the 2nd Corps, and Lee's concerned that the 1st Corps guys won't respond well to that because of the rivalry there. So he's going to bring Anderson over from the 3rd Corps. Anderson had been in the 2nd Corps, and when Lee reorganized the Army in the wake of Chancellorsville, he's going to move Anderson's division to serve under Hill. That reorganization of the Army took 2 corps of 30,000 and divided it into 3 corps of 20,000 each. Anderson's men were part of that numerical shuffle. So Anderson comes back. He's not a guy who's got a lot of razzle-dazzle. Lee had worked with him during Chancellorsville pretty directly. He sort of gets a pass for underperforming at Gettysburg because Hill, his immediate supervisor, didn't direct the battle as aggressively as he could have. And so Anderson sort of, gets excused for that a little bit. Again, not a lot of razzle-dazzle, but he's a known quantity. He's someone that Lee thinks the 1st Corps will respond to and that Lee can depend on. He started the war as a colonel of the 1st South Carolina, has worked his way up, had a solid service. There's nothing about Anderson I can really say that is like, this dude is awesome. This is awesome. But he's stalwart. He's dependable. In fact, when Longstreet eventually comes back in October of 1964, after that wounding, Lee's going to look for a way to try to keep Anderson around. He'll create a 4th Corps and put Anderson in charge of that as a way to, keep Anderson and his experience and his stalwartness at ready availability. So that's how Lee's going to solve this immediate command crisis. But then a second crisis erupts because that social disease of A.P. Hill's erupts. And so he's knocked out during the next phase of the campaign, and Jubal Early will have that opportunity to be in temporary corps command again. Early is someone that Lee has looked at increasingly throughout the war to place in positions of greater responsibility. He really first turns to Early in the wake of the Battle of Fredericksburg, where Early disobeyed Stonewall Jackson's orders, marched to the sound of the guns, and saved the right flank of Lee's army at Fredericksburg when George Gordon Meade broke through at the Slaughter Pen Farm. A counterattack by Early helps drive Meade out of that position. Even though he disobeyed orders, nothing protects you like success. And so, Jackson can't put him under arrest as he might normally do or scold him or anything. He sort of writes around it in his official reports, does not laud Early, but Lee gives Early the cover he needs to survive any grumpiness by Jackson. And so then at the second Fredericksburg campaign, when Lee's going to shift out toward Chancellorsville to fighting Joe Hooker, he's going to leave Early back in Fredericksburg as his rear guard. And so, Lee's trusting his whole army to Jubal Early at Fredericksburg to protect the rear there. During the fall of 1963, Early will have a temporary command of the 2nd Corps during the Mine Run, Rappahannock Station and Mine Run phases of that campaign. When Ewell comes back, Early returns to division command, but even Ewell will sort of lean on Early and his expertise, which will create some problems for Early as a result of the wilderness, and he defers perhaps a little too much to Early. But Early's going to get the call. He's going to be in charge of the 3rd Corps during the Spotsylvania phase of the campaign. And that's where things will continue to come off the wheels for Lee. Jeb Stuart is going to get lured away from the Army by a raid conducted by federal cavalry under the command of Phil Sheridan and at Yellow Tavern on the 11th of May, excuse me. Stuart will be shot in the gut at the Battle of Yellow Tavern. He'll die the following day. When Lee gets that news, which is in the middle of the fighting at the Muleshoe Salient, which is absolutely brutal and awful, Lee will retreat to his tent and really shaken up. And, he says of Stuart, he never brought me a piece of wrong information. And, that speaks highly of the way that Lee thought of this young man. Despite some of his weaknesses or flaws, he always performed well for Lee. He responded to Lee's mentorship, his surrogate fathership. So it's a huge emotional, devastating loss for Lee, even in a way that Longstreet's loss wasn't, or that Jackson's loss wasn't. Who to replace him? Well, General Wade Hampton, 46-year-old, the wealthiest guy in the Confederacy, so wealthy we still know him by his dollar signs. And that's about what we know about him. But it's going to take a while for Hampton to really kind of come into his own, because the other candidate for command is Fitzhugh Lee, a relative of Robert E. Lee, a Virginian. And Lee, who do I give command to? And he sort of wants to give it to his nephew, but Hampton's really earned it. So there's going to be a leadership vacuum in the cavalry for a while as that situation sort of works its way out. Hampton, a superior cavalryman, will eventually just clearly earn the position and get that command. Hampton, and that's the one thing we'll say about, as the A team breaks up here, we don't really lose a step with Hampton. He's going to perform just as well, just as admirably as Stuart, if maybe not quite as flashy with the ostrich plume in his hair. He's still going to be pretty solid. So now this is what the team looks like. We've got fighting Dick Ewell, old Baldy, Lee's bad old man, and reportedly the richest man in the Confederacy. This is not your A team. Okay. I like Liam Neeson. He is not George Peppard. Okay. And, we're trading up Dirk Benedict for Bradley Cooper. Most people would say that's a pretty good trade, in the same way we're trading Stuart for Hampton. But, this is not, we don't have Mr. T over here. Right. Okay. And so this is not your A team. So as Lee then advances out of Spotsylvania, his confidence is deeply shaken in the team that he has to work with. If we look at how Spotsylvania goes for poor Dick Ewell, he has a rough day on the 10th when Emory Upton punches through his line. Ewell does a really good job of directing reinforcements into place and resealing that gap. But, Lee's like, why are these guys breaking through on your front? 2 days later, when Grant punches through at the tip of the mule shoe and Lee comes to the battlefield and he sees Dick Ewell sputtering, swearing, completely losing his cool and incoherent in the orders that he's trying to give. Remember, his verbal orders, particularly when he's upset, are incoherent. And we see it on the 12th. And it's so much so that Lee has to give him a timeout. General Ewell, how do you propose to control your men if you cannot control yourself? And then a few days later, at the 19th, as Ewell does a wide flank march to hit Grant's supply line at a place called Harris Farm as part of the Spotsylvania campaign, fresh reinforcements flood onto the field and nearly overwhelm Ewell, nearly destroying the Second Corps, and only darkness allows them to escape. And so these incidents really underscore or undermine Lee's confidence in Ewell, which was already shaky. And so Lee's going to look for an active opportunity to get rid of Ewell. When the dysentery finally kicks in and gets Ewell, he'll eventually have to go back to Richmond to recoup. And Lee will tell him, why don't you stay there and be in charge of Richmond's defenses? And Ewell's like, no, I'm feeling better. I can come back to service. No. I need you to stay in Richmond. And Lee will move early over to command the Second Corps when Hill comes back. And Ewell just, will try to regain his field command, and Lee won't have it because he just doesn't trust this B team. So by the time we get to the North Anna River, where we've got Ewell, Lee has no faith in him at this point. And of course, this is where Ewell starts to get that dysentery. We've got Anderson, new to command, but no one who has, demonstrated any sort of razzle dazzle. And we've got A.P. Hill, who just botched things the night before at Jericho Mills. He's just come off his social disease, missed Spotsylvania, so he's not dependable for health reasons. And of course, he's performed poorly at the corps level. Even if Longstreet were still here, Okay. Longstreet's someone who could say, Anderson, you be in charge of the Corps while I take over for Lee. There's at least someone who could strike that blow. But Lee doesn't have anybody who he feels confident enough to say, like, you step up to fill my shoes, put someone else in charge of your Corps. Lee is, at this moment, 3 weeks into this campaign, the indispensable man of the Confederacy, and he is alone. He is starkly alone. And we can go all the way back to when he took over the 7 days and look at his brigade losses, his division losses, his corps losses, and we can see this creeping leadership vacuum that finally catches up to him here in the Overland campaign. He has no one who's able to rise up. That's one of the important distinctions between the Confederate Army and the Union Army during the war. Is like, the Union Army, it's based on seniority and rank, and guys sort of get their chance to move up based on how long that they've been there. And it takes a long time for the cream to rise to the top there. So by the time Grant finally becomes Lieutenant General, that took him a while to happen and rise to the top. And finally, we get commanders who rise to the occasion as the war kind of gets into 64. The opposite happens with the Confederate Army. They're starting from scratch. They tend to find really good guys from the beginning. So we've got a lot of strong leadership early in the war. And as the attrition wears that leadership away, we don't have quite that great talent pool to rise to the top. So, we see that sort of manifest itself here in these, opening weeks of the Overland campaign. So as the campaign will then continue, Lee is going to really wrestle with this command problem that he has, and he's not going to have folks that he can depend on at a time when Grant's going to be able to continue reinforcing his army, bringing in new blood, bringing in new officers, bringing in new men. Lee is not going to have those sorts of resources to draw on. He gets John Breckinridge and Pickett here. Pickett, a man who he has no confidence in after Pickett's charge. He's glad to send Pickett away on any detached duty he can at this point. Breckinridge will at least show some competence and step up and do fairly well for Lee in a subordinate role here. And so, as a result, if we look from the Wilderness through Cold Harbor, Lee's going to lose another division commander captured at Spotsylvania at the brigade level. He's going to have 8 brigadiers killed, 3 mortally wounded, 1 captured. 1 will be out from sickness, and 19 wounded. Okay, 1 out of 4 officers at the brigade level are going to be taken off the board. And so we can see the ongoing impact of that leadership vacuum. So, of course, it's no wonder that he's lying in his tent, wishing for someone to strike the blow, and he has no one to do it. His A team is gone. His B team is not capable. The glory days of Lee's leadership team are well behind them, and he has no one to step up. It's going to be Robert E. Lee in a very lonely position for the rest of the war. So I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War Podcast. Thanks for spending a little time with me today. I hope this proved enlightening. We will see you online and on the battlefield.